Hey everyone, and welcome back to another tutorial. In this one you're going to learn about symbols in JavaScript, how they're different from primitives or strings, and what are the cool use cases of using symbols in general. So watch the video till the end and let me know in the comments how you find it. Also, if you are not subscribed to the channel, do it right now and make sure to press the bell icon so you get notified about the next videos. Without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so symbols. Symbols are very interesting data types in JavaScript. They're quite similar to string, but a bit different in a case that uniqueness comes with symbols, which means that all the symbols that you create, even if they use a similar identifier, they're always going to be unique. And let me show you how. Let's suppose we have two strings like pr1 and then that is called id, and here we have pr2 and then that is going to be, let's say, id as well. Now if you would do something like console.log pr1 equals pr2, that would essentially say that yes, they are exactly the same. But if you had the same things with symbols, that would be different. First of all, whenever you want to create a symbol, you do it something like this. So you say symbol and here you use the identifier of that symbol, but I wouldn't call this an identifier because the symbol itself acts as an identifier. But let's say for the sake of example, if I had, let's say, AR, I'm just bad at naming variables. So if I do something like this, then what you would see is that if I do AR1 equals to AR2, then this would essentially say that this is not equal, even though they look exactly the same. And it's not just about being different variables. If I just had to do this, something like this, then even then it would say that this is false because these two symbols are different. And the reason for that is that whenever we use this statement in JavaScript, it creates a new unique symbol. And the benefit of this is that if you had an object and you had to write a property for this, you would not be worried about that someone else in your team would also use the same property for that object, because this avoids something called naming collisions or property collisions itself. And we are going to look into how that works. So we are going to start with a really simple example. We are going to say something like, hey, we have a class that's called 3JS, and this class has two properties like an ID here. An ID could be something like 3JS, and then also it would have, let's say, a version that is, let's say, 2.3.4. Now if I create a new instance of object, let's say 3JS here, and then do new 3JS, that would mean that now we have got a new instance. And let's say if someone comes here, let's say the first dev comes here and says, hey, the 3JS dot metadata is, or metadata equals something like this, and here I would, let's say, write the first dev's name. So we could say like dev, and here we can say Ahsan. Now similar thing happens, and then we get a new dev in the team and they accidentally use the same property name and change this to Alan, let's say. If that happens, then let's see what is the output when we see this 3JS variable. So 3JS is now going to output as something like this. So you can see that here we have 3JS, which is the instance of the object. It has the ID, version, but the metadata now contains Alan because the second dev essentially overrode first dev's values. And this is because of a potential naming collision. But if we wanted to do something different in that case, then what would happen is that they would use different symbols for this. So first of all, I'm going to remove this so we don't end up showing all of those. But let's say if this is the case, then the first dev would create a symbol. Let's say they could call it first dev symbol, and here they would say something like symbol, and then they can use a same property. Let's say they call it metadata. Okay, now instead of using this metadata as a dot notation here, we can use this symbol as the associative identifier, or I don't know what's called, but when you access this property from an object, this is sort of called the associative array. So let's say this is a property, this symbol is being used as a property here, and then we are assigning this. And let's say the second dev is smart as well, and they also do the same thing. So let's say this is called second dev symbol in that case. And if that's the case, then they can also do something like this. So they can do second dev sim equals to metadata. Now notice that they both use the same string for identification, but that does not matter because a symbol is anyways unique. So if I now log this, let's see what happens. You can see that here we get the first symbol which has dev Ahsan, and the second symbol is dev Alan. Notice that the symbol has the same string identifier or whatever you want to call it, but they do not collide and they do not override each other. But what is even interesting is that someone who is not happy with their life and they want to quit their job and they want to override, let's say, all of the object properties for some weird reason, they would do something like this. They would go and say for key in, let's say, 3JS, and then they would do something like, hey, let's say 3JS dot, or for the key, let's make it null. Let's remove all of the object properties for some weird reason. And if they do so, what would happen in that case? If I play this right, let's see what happens. You see that the ID was overridden, the version was overridden, but the symbols were not overridden, and there's a specific reason for this. The reason is that if I just log into here and say, hey, console log the key that you are about to override, then you would see that they would only show the ID and the version, because when you run a loop over this object in terms of finding out what properties this has, this would only show the normal properties or the primitive properties like the ID and the version, but they would not highlight symbol, which means that no one can accidentally write it. They could not even do something like this. If I do, let's say 3js dot, I could say something like metadata, and then I do something like this, or let's say try to access. So if I do something like console.log metadata, then what you would see here is that you would see the value undefined here. And the reason is that this dot metadata, that doesn't exist. That's not how you can get access to a symbol or an object that has a symbol as a key. If you want to get this object, the only way of doing that is to use the exact symbol that is being used as a key here, and that makes it super powerful, which means that now I need to use something like this, and I cannot even do this, the first def symbol. That wouldn't work either. That would say undefined. The only way to use it is using this notation, which I'm using exactly the same notation here. So if I use this, then I should be able to access. You can see that now it says def s, right? This is how you would access a particular symbol or a value that is pointing to a symbol in an object. Now I could do one more thing here, and that is instead of logging this, I could say something like object.keys, and here if I say 3js, what would you expect here? You would only see two keys, and that is the ID and the version. The symbols are not shown in that case. So this is really important to understand. Now the next thing is something interesting, and that is I'm using the for key in loop here, or the for in loop here, but what if I wanted to use the for off loop here? So that would mean that I'm gonna say something like for value of 3js, and here I could simply say value, right? So if I do this, what would happen? I'm gonna remove the console logs here, and even this one as well, or actually let's just log 3js at the end. So if I do this, we would essentially get an error, and that is 3js is not iterable. Why is that? Because objects usually are not iterable, arrays are iterable, which means that you can iterate over arrays, but you cannot run a for off on 3js. Now we could change that by essentially using something like the Symbol.iterator, which is essentially what is used for arrays as well. So if we want to implement that, I could easily go and say something like 3js dot prototype, and then here I can use the Symbol.iterator, which is something that was introduced in obviously ES6, but then is implemented for a lot of things in JavaScript later on. So this essentially requires a function, which is a generator function. And if you're interested in knowing what a function is, let me know in the comments, and I might create a video of that as well. Let's say we get this generator function. What this would do is that this essentially runs for every iteration, and it yields whatever you want to take out. So let's say if I say something, that means that when this loop is going to run, which means that when this loop is going to run, this is gonna go inside this object, and then it would yield something whenever this loop runs. So here, since this is a function, this only would return something only one time, because we are not doing something fancy here. So now if I run the same code, you will see that it's not iterable, and that is because we has iteration, it should be iterator. And then if I play this now, you will see that we would get a log. Here you can see that we got 3js, and that is something that we are logging in here, but we are not logging any value here. So let's log the value here. So we'll say console.log value, and in that case, see what happens. So you see that here it logged something. So this loop ran only one time because this iterator is only yielding one thing. Now if we wanted to log everything out of it, we could use something like for and then key in this. We are looping over using for key value. So we are looping using the for in loop here, and then we would say something like, hey, yield the value key, and here we can do something like this and key, which would mean that we are going to log an array every time that would contain the key and the value of it. So if we run this now, let's see what happens. So here you see that it logged first this, which is id 3js, so key and value, so id 3js, and the version is 2.3.4. This is something that we are doing here, but we could also do something like key and then value, this key, and that would essentially log an object every time. So here you would see that key. So this is how you would implement Symbol.iterator, right? Now this is quite similar to something like an array. So if I have, let's say, an array that has something like an apple, and then we have, let's say, a banana, and then let's say we also have grapes. So if we have an array of this, then we could do something like this. And even instead of using this for loop, we could do something like console.log, and here this, right? Now what this does essentially, if you don't know, is that this uses Symbol.iterator behind the scenes, and it logs this, an array that is essentially being spread here every time that is happening. How do I know this? Because if we change the global implementation of this iterator, we would see something else right there in the console log. Let me show you. So if I do something like array.prototype, and here if I say symbol.iterator, then I can create a generator function, which is something like this. So we are going to use a generator function, and then inside here we can say something like for, and then we can say key in, and then this. And then what we can do is that instead of yielding a single value when we do this notation, so you see it right here, so we essentially have the single value. So here we would do something like yield, and here we can essentially yield the key and the value just like this. So if we do this, let's see what happens. We yield an array of the objects instead of just the properties, and you can see that the key for obviously an array is the number, so the 0, 1, 2. And that is how you could play fancy with JavaScript if you want, but yes, at your own risk. Do not say that Ahsan taught me that, please. Now let's talk about something interesting. If you see, we have, let's say, a function which is called main, and inside here, let's suppose we create a symbol. So let's say this is going to be my symbol, and here we say symbol, and then say my symbol. And let's say we want to create something in the global scope for some reason, and if we want to use that into multiple functions, what would happen in that? We can also create a new function. Let's say function, second function, and then we would obviously try to get this value somehow. So if I do this, then what would happen is that I could say global, and then my symbol, and then we could say some secret, right? And if I now want to get access to this value or this some secret, the only way for me to get this value is to use this variable, right? Because this is a symbol. I cannot just use this because it's a symbol. So the only way of doing a console.log here in the second function would be that I take this variable out like here, and then do something like this, let my symbol, and then do this, and then I can here now access this global my symbol, and I should be able to access the value. So let's try this out now. So main, and then this is going to be second function. And now if I try to log this, we'll see what happens. So in this case, you see that we got the some secret value here in this console log, but I had to take this out. But what if I wanted to create a global symbol and use it everywhere? We can actually do that. And the reason for that would be similar to access this. And the way of doing that is to use symbol.for. Now, when you use symbol.for, it essentially tries to either get this particular symbol from the global symbol registry, or if it does not exist in the registry, then it creates it, and then you can access it anywhere else. So now instead of using this mySym variable, which does not exist now anywhere, because if I run this, obviously show an error that mySym is fine. So if I need to get this, I can just use this symbol for here directly, and that would essentially get my value. So here you can see that I can actually get the value of my secret. So you can create symbol using. Now if you wanted to also get this string for some reason, you can also try to log that as well. For instance, I could log here console.log, and then I could say, hey, what is this key that is being used in this symbol that I have? So you could do something like symbol, and then symbol dot or key, and here I can use the symbol. So what would happen in that case is this would say for key is not a function, or it's key for, I think. Yeah, exactly. So here you can see that if I use a key for by providing a symbol, it returns this symbol value. Now, why would you want that? I don't know, but this is something that exists. Now, finally, let's talk about a really important topic. If I had to save some secret inside an object, would that be accessible anywhere by anyone? Is that something that symbol does? And I would say no, because whatever you create inside a particular object is definitely accessible in a particular scenario. So let's say this 3JS object that we create, let's say this second dev is trying to hide some secret inside here. So he would say something like const secret symbol, and here we can say secret symbol equals symbol, and then they would say something like second dev secret, okay? And then they do something like 3JS and then secret symbol, and then they do something like, hey, this is my secret. Now the thing is that if I try to log this particular 3JS object, let's see what happens. So even if I log this, then you would be able to see the secret. So this is not private, which means that it's not hidden. This is still available. You don't specifically have to provide the symbol to see this value. So you can always see that in your logs, which means that this is not private. And another way of getting actually the value of this is that, for instance, let's say, hey, I can see this log, but I don't have a way of accessing this, because for that I would have to use this symbol. I would have to access this symbol, right? And I don't have it, right? For some reason, let's say this variable is unknown. I don't know where this is exposed. But the thing is that you can actually get this symbol in a particular way. And you do that by doing something like this. So you can get all of the symbols of an object by doing symbols equals, and then you could say something like object dot get on property symbol, and then you provide the object. So you say some JS. If I log the symbols, let's see what happens. So if I log the symbols, you would see all of the symbols. Now the thing is that now that I've got the symbols, I can simply do symbol dot for each, and here I can get each symbol, and then I can do something like console.log, and then I can say 3JS and symbol. And if I do this, then that would essentially print out or get access to the actual secret. So you can get access to the symbol, you can get access to the values of it, but hopefully when the private properties in JavaScript are available, then we might have more private properties or more privacy when it comes to hiding things. And I think that is pretty much it, what I wanted to share about symbols. Alright, so I hope that you liked the video. If you did, press the thumbs up button and also subscribe to the channel to be notified about the next videos that are going to be coming in the next coming days, for instance. And if you have anything in mind that you would like me to cover in the next videos, let me know in the comments. I stream on Twitch every Wednesday and Saturday, so come and hang out with us, talk to the amazing community that we have, and also see me doing live coding and making a lot of mistakes as we go forward. And hey, if you're interested in Angular, I wrote this book that is doing amazing in terms of sales and also community adoption. So if you are looking forward to improve your skills, get this one and get started. And as always, happy coding, and see this next video.